I'm joined today by broadcaster and lawyer and friend, Andrew Eborn. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
I'm very well, Neil, and it's nice to connect to you over so many miles with this terrible disaster that we've had with this IT meltdown. Does warn you about dependency on technology, doesn't it?
It does. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, what a few days, a week or so it's been, with the shooting of Trump. With the recent advent of a new government in 10 Downing Street in London, with the trouble unfolding in Leeds on Friday, and then this whatever it was, this technological falling over. If it wasn't a heat wave coming, it would feel in every sense that things are hotting up.
Oh, no, absolutely. But again, it sort of highlights that point when you get broadcasters and airlines and banking systems all collapsing. And it wasn't even as a result of third-party action, from what we can understand. It was an update which was supposed to be basically go seamlessly. It didn't go seamlessly, and the whole thing grinds to a halt. Whilst I'm an advocate of technologies, I speak around the world as a futurist, encouraging people to embrace technology. I'd always make sure that there's a plan B, because if you're heavily reliant on it and the thing collapses, then we're basically left adrift.
And when it comes to we've got to contemplate what happened to President Trump. What did you make? I know it's impossible to be clear about exactly what happened and the rest of it, but what did you make of the immediate aftermath? The way in which the various media fell over themselves in all manner of ways of reporting what had happened.
Yeah, there was all the backtracking. You're right. The words that people have been using, which is basically encouraging violence, if you like. And Biden himself was sort of turned around and say, when he meant let's have him in the crossfire, he didn't mean that at all. He meant you've got to focus on Trump. So they're all backpedaling on that sort of stuff. CNN have been much more gentle, apparently, on Trump's family when they're interviewing them and so on and so forth. But there are so many questions about that particular incident. I mean, if the security service, some of the best in the world, weren't able to spot somebody who's just 100 yards or so away from the main stage. It's extraordinary. I also saw a number of the witnesses there talking about how they spotted this particular person with his sniper and so on and so forth, and they had alerted various people, but it wasn't until later that they did anything about it. So there are many, many questions to be answered, not least about how that particular person got onto the roof just 100 yards away from the president or the past president.
What was your reaction to the way in which the Labour government hit the street running towards its various targets?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, they're only a couple of weeks into it, as we say. And we had the King's speech where they outlined all of these plans, some of which were a surprise. Some weren't properly mentioned, like AI and so on and so forth, and voting for under 16. Everybody expected that to happen. It wasn't in the speech. Time will tell. They promised a timeline of 100 days, for example, with this new employment bill. And obviously, it's not 100 days from when it might be enacted, because it has to go through the process. But there's all sorts of changes there, and mega rights, if you like, for employees now, and giving them rights from the very first day when they start, the end of 0-hour contracts and all of those sort of things. And it's got to, basically, the devil will be in the detail, but it is early days yet. Let's see what happens. But I predict that people will be disappointed, because politics follows that pattern, doesn't it? We have a sort of stage where everybody is so desperate that they want to have something new, and that was the whole Labour campaign, was about change. And I suspect that a lot of people will be very disappointed that change may not be as quick as people predict. But also, if you look at the voter turnout, actually the biggest winner in the election was apathy. It had the lowest turnout for a long time, below 60%. Labour, whilst they got a large percentage of that, basically the votes were fragmented to a lot of these new parties. So Reform, for example, got 14% of the vote, but only 5 seats, whereas the Liberal Democrats got 12%, less than Reform's total vote, and they ended up with 72. So people who are thinking about a democratic system are going to be a bit frustrated and disappointed, I think. And I think that's going to pan out over the next few weeks.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, We're upon the first break already. Since as you probably spotted, I'm broadcasting from home on account of the technological problems that we're talking about. So I'm severely tempted to go and make myself a cup of tea in the break. But afterwards, we'll be discussing the first report published by the United Kingdom COVID-19 inquiry, which has been investigating how well we were prepared for the outbreak of a pandemic. Andrew Eborn, what's your reaction? Admittedly, this is the first of what are expected to be several, statements coming out. But what do you make of the tenor of what we've had so far?
Well, the language is incredibly strong, isn't it?
Sorry, Bella. I was just meaning
I know we're traveling. It might be a bit over. Yeah, too many Andrews, but it's a slightly different one. I know it's the joy of working remotely. The language, I think, is very interesting, isn't it? Because it's very strong. She talks about serious errors of state and fatal strategic flaws. And I always say history repeats itself because we don't learn the lessons from history. And in the report, they talk about actually they were ill prepared, and what they did was wrong. They basically were doing it as though it might be a flu epidemic or something along those sort of basis. But it is the first report, and what I find shocking actually is that we've just had the election, and not once did COVID come up in the questions on either part, any of the parties, as to how they behaved and the responses that they did. There will be many more questions which still have to be answered, and I think things about the inoculations and so on and so forth, that's going to be coming further down the line. So serious questions to be answered, but so far the report is fairly condemning.
Bella, it was shocking to me, really, that Sir Ian Vallance, Chief Scientific Officer during the so-called pandemic, has now been made Minister of Science or similar by the incoming Labour government, which, if that isn't rubbing people's noses in the intention to carry on much as though nothing had happened, could they have done anything more to annoy the wounded public?
I totally agree with you, and I think this is one of the problems with these kind of sliding door, rotating windows that we have of people moving through the scientific world and moving from pharmaceutical to government to NHS and all the way through. And we don't actually have any way of linking this through. One thing that Baroness Hallett does talk about is a lack of transparency through this. And I think we'd all agree on that. And she actually talks about the fact that there was a lack of parliamentary scrutiny, which throughout the pandemic. We'd absolutely agree on that. And when we were looking at the accountability deficit, one of the things that really stood out to us was when we looked at the care home mandates, which was a shocking thing that happened in 18 months in to the pandemic. But at that point, there was not even an impact assessment. So legally, you couldn't pass that law without an impact assessment. This was raised by the House of Lords on a number of occasions, and it was raised by parliamentarians who actually described themselves as feeling like they were living in the Scream, and yet it was still bulldozed through.
Coming up, we'll be debating whether the UK should be adopting much stronger measures in order to try and achieve net zero, whatever that means, or whether it is a futile enterprise. Don't go anywhere. Andrew Eborn, what say you? I think it's in the marrow of my bones that I'm suspicious about collectivist global solutions that will entertain no debate and talk about consensus and the science. What's your reaction?
I think you're absolutely right. Whenever you shut down debate, then absolutely our hackles should rise, because the reality, we must question everything. We've become so reliant on so-called experts, and time again experts have been proved wrong. What I found fascinating in the recent election was actually Reform's policy was saying, look, we can get rid of all our troubles about the NHS and underfunding here and so on and so forth if we simply abandon the net zero pledge, which was an interesting take on it. And he was accused, Richard Tice at that stage was accused of weaponizing the climate crisis. But we have to be able to question it, and we have to make sure that we listen to all sides in the debate, because if you shut down debate, then basically you're going to shut down getting the truth.
Greg, you talk about renewables, and for most people, myself included, we're talking there about wind turbines and solar panels. Now,
Yeah.
seriously, Greg, those are not sources of energy that can be relied upon round the clock, and most specifically, they cannot be relied upon. The sun doesn't shine when we need it, and the wind doesn't blow when we need it. In what sense is anyone even being realistic about talking about alternatives?
Absolutely agree. And this is where actually now there's been some planning law changes for battery storage, which is something that we need to do. We lose approximately 10 to 20% every day of our renewable power. Now, if we spent money on actually battery storage for that renewable power, so we actually had it at the source, for the national grid to draw on, that would actually help the national grid massively, and we could actually start building upon that. And now you can actually get planning permission on Greenbelt for critical infrastructure for these battery solutions. And it's something that more and more people are going to start investing in. And I think combined with the new Labour government, I think it could be something that works really well.
Greg Gormley, thank you very much for your brave contribution in the face of my cynicism. I have to reiterate that as far as I'm concerned, the so-called climate crisis is the biggest hoax yet foisted upon the human species on this planet. But thank you very much for your insights, Greg.
Thank you.
Next on the show, I'll be discussing a momentous week, truly momentous week in American politics, as President Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt before giving us the name of his running mate for his presidential bid. I'll see you soon. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. To put it mildly, it's been an eventful week in US politics with an assassination attempt on President Trump and a new Republican vice presidential candidate being named, and President Biden apparently coming down with COVID. Here to discuss all of that and more, I'm joined now by Jimmy Dore, comedian and political commentator. Hello, Jimmy.
Hello, great to be with you again.
Oh, thanks, Jimmy. Always good to hear your voice. I listened to our mutual friend Tucker Carlson, cogitating in the aftermath of what happened, and he said that it seemed to him that something had changed that day. The shooting transformed Trump in some sort of way that he is now visibly a leader and a brave man. What was your gut reaction?
It was uncommonly brave. I couldn't think of a politician doing that. You'd think that once there's an active shooter and you've already been shot in a part of your head, that you would just stay down, and he didn't. And what was even so that was really fascinating. And once you saw him raise his fist and say "fight, fight, fight," you couldn't help but feel the emotion of the moment. And then his crowd, the thing that I think is even more remarkable than that was that normally when there's a shooting, people just scatter and they trip over each other and they trample each other. And they didn't do that. They sat there calmly and they kind of followed Trump's lead. And I think that was an incredible moment of leadership, right? Because maybe if he didn't do that, maybe if he didn't get up and show his resilience and put his fist in the air and say fight, maybe they would have got scared and scrambled. But there was someone behind him, a couple people behind him who got shot, and a fireman actually got shot and died. So and people did not scramble around and trample over each other, which is what always happens in those situations. So yeah, it was remarkable how it's changed him. I don't know. I did hear that leaked phone call where he was on the phone with Bobby Kennedy. And I've never heard a politician sound more magnanimous. And even to Joe Biden, the guy who's been prosecuting him, using lawfare, weaponizing the justice system against his political opponent, Donald Trump, he was even magnanimous to him and said nice things about him on the call. So I'm not close enough to him like Tucker to know that it's changed him, but it certainly was quite, it was a moment of leadership, and it was stunning, actually. I didn't think Trump had that in him.
Yeah, you mentioned the clip that went out of Bobby Kennedy Jr. Receiving a phone call in the aftermath, and I was struck by the way in which Donald Trump, and it was him talking, not Kennedy. He absolutely does not sound on that call like you might say the caricature Trump that's always pushed by the legacy media. He wasn't. And when he spoke at the convention, he didn't take the opportunity to be divisive or to stoke anything at all. He really does come across in those unguarded moments. And if there was a definition of an unguarded moment, it was that bullet, whizzing past his ear. He comes across as quite different than the way his opponents generally seek to portray him.
Well, yeah, they have to portray him as a madman. They have to portray him as this racist, madman, white supremacist, all these things, because Donald Trump, my theory is this, that Donald Trump is a deal maker. He really is a successful businessman, and they used to all praise him before he ran for president. They used to all want to be they were all golf buddies, right? That he was on every late night talk show in America. They gave him his own television show for over 10 years. They gave him, he's got his own star on the Walk of Fame on Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, the establishment loved that guy. So the fact that he didn't come up through the traditional political machine, so they didn't have control of him. And, it's not that he was that wildly different or he was going to govern that wildly different, but they didn't have complete control of him. So they had to try to demonize him. And then when the demonization didn't work, they tried to Russiagate him, and they tried to say he was a traitor to our country. And there's lots of theories about this, that he puts an ugly, because he speaks in such a brash way, that he puts an ugly face on imperialism, and it's harder to invade, smaller countries and steal their natural resources with a guy like Donald Trump than it is with a guy like Barack Obama or Joe Biden. And so he puts a bad face on imperialism, especially now that they've been painting him as a madman and a white supremacist for all these years. They can't have that. And he's also bad for their wars. I think the real big deal is that Donald Trump, because he comes from business, he's always looking for a deal. And he prides himself on, his book was called The Art of the Deal. So he's going to find a deal. He even said that in his speech last night. He said, I will end that Ukraine war. It would have never happened if I was president. And I can end a war with one phone call. And so he prides himself on that. Whereas it seems like everybody else in the political spectrum in America prides themselves on being a warmonger.
That's it then for our TV hour. Thanks to all my guests. Thanks to Andrew Eborn for bearing with me and handling this slightly different version of the show. Please, to all of you, stay tuned for the brilliant Free Speech Nation. But we have more content coming up online. As I say, Jimmy Dore is staying with me, moving on afterwards to discussing Russia with George Samueli and the rise of the right with Ralph Schulhammer, another familiar friend of the show. Don't miss any of it, and I'll see you next week. Good evening and welcome along to the second hour of the Neil Oliver Show online. This is where I get the chance to be a bit more relaxed, to let conversations breathe a little, to let my guests cogitate and develop thoughts. Welcome back, and let's pick up with the conversation that began in the first hour, talking to comedian and political commentator Jimmy Dore. Welcome back, Jimmy.
Great to see you, Neil.
Jimmy, like you, I was paying some attention to the way in which, let's say those parts of the legacy media in the States that do not approve of President Trump and much prefer President Biden, the way in which they reacted. Good Morning Joe on MSNBC, and for example, the way in which that show simply didn't broadcast in the immediate aftermath. I watched some of your content with that in mind. I wonder if you could develop some of your thoughts there.
Well, it was funny because they're supposed to be like their flagship program that everybody watches in the morning, and they didn't let them on the air because Joe Scarborough and the people he surrounds himself with are such foaming at the mouth maniacs that they were afraid they were going to say something inappropriate about Donald Trump's assassination attempt, and it turns out they have been saying that. So they replaced him with someone named Joy-Ann Reid, who's possibly the only person at that station crazier than him. And she's now floating a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump staged that whole event and that it's fishy and all things like that. Hey, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked that aren't being answered. And the official story certainly doesn't make sense. But the idea that Donald Trump, who got 4 deferments from the Vietnam War, when he's leading an election and it looks like he's going to win a landslide, would all of a sudden go, hey, you know what? I got an idea. Let's have somebody shoot me in the head just for kicks and, just to see if it'll get my numbers up even more so I can win by an even bigger margin. And right at the last second, I'll turn my head and just have him blow a hole through my ear and then kill a guy behind me. So that's the crazy conspiracy theories they were afraid that Morning Joe was going to say, and they replaced him with someone like Joy-Ann Reid. And of course, she's just as crazy. They're all crazy over there. I mean, they did Russiagate at the top of their lungs they're still doing it. So it hasn't stopped for 8 years now. And which is the goofiest, most easily debunked conspiracy theory that I've ever seen, that the president of the United States was a traitor and working for another country. In fact, they had an investigation into it for years, and the conclusion was absolutely no evidence that would substantiate that allegation. That didn't bother them. They just keep doing it. They just keep going over and over. They say that since he picked his vice president, J.D. Vance, that at MSNBC, they say the person who's most happy about that is Vladimir Putin. I mean, they just won't stop. So yeah, that was really funny. And Joe Scarborough, his feathers got ruffled because they took him off the air because they know what a nut he is. And when they let him back on the air, he said if they ever do that again, that he's going to quit. He didn't use those words. The words he said was, "I won't be sitting in this chair." So that was really funny to see that even NBC knows how unhinged the hosts of their flagship show is.
There was something very glaring and revealing, I thought. Given that for months the language of, targeting Trump and suggesting that it would be a good idea, to be rid, was there all the time. And then when it actually almost happened, they just didn't know how to respond. Because if they've been calling him a Hitler or a Stalin or a would-be dictator for months at least. And you would have thought, if that was true, then you would want rid of him. But then when a bullet actually flew and it grazed Trump, and as you say, another bullet killed a husband and father, when that which they seemed to be calling for was all but conjured into being, they suddenly didn't know what to do.
Well, they've been not only calling Donald Trump Hitler and Stalin and a threat to our democracy. The day before the assassination attempt, Joe Biden was on stage in front of a crowd saying, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, Donald Trump and MAGA, meaning his political movement, are a threat to our democracy. And so he's not only smearing and slandering Donald Trump, his political opponent, but the citizens of the United States, half the country, who are prepared to vote for him, right? And so, yeah, you're right. When that happened, they didn't know how to handle it. In fact, Joe Biden gave a speech where he eulogized the husband and father who was shot. Just the day before, you were saying those people were a threat to our democracy. Just the day before, you were saying those people don't respect the Constitution, that those people aren't Americans. And then as soon as they got shot, you're right, he had to completely change his tune. It's like, oh, well, this guy is a great American, and we have our hearts and soul go out to him. Our thoughts and prayers are with him. And they didn't know how to critique Donald Trump because the only way they know how to critique him is in the most hyperbolic ways, by saying that he's going to be a dictator on day 2021, which is a complete mischaracterization of what he said. He said he said I'm going to be a dictator on day just for the first day because he's going to pass executive orders about the border, and which is completely within his constitutional rights to do. In fact, people are voting for him, so he does do that. And so they're also, when he talked about if he wasn't president, that there would be a bloodbath in the auto industry, which is a very common term in politics. They talk about bloodbaths when it comes to elections or bloodbaths when it comes to economics or anything. And so they misquote him and said that he's pretending that there's going to be an actual physical, violent bloodbath if he's not elected. Of course, so they don't know how any other way to talk about him. So it was funny to watch them try to now talk about Donald Trump without calling him Hitler, calling him a threat to our democracy, calling him an enemy of our country and an enemy of our Constitution, and he's going to be a dictator. It was comical. It's still comical to watch them do that. But so now they're saying that his vice presidential pick is a favorite of Vladimir Putin. They went back to that on MSNBC. And Rachel Maddow says that he's obviously a racist because he likes, what is that, J.K. Rowling? Now I can't remember, the Lord of the Rings. So they're really unhinged over there. Like when I was getting my chops in politics in the late 80s, early 90s, it was always the right wing in the United States, the Republican Party, that were the people that were unhinged, that wanted to pass laws that made it mandatory that you had to pray to a god in school. And they were always on the fringes, but it's completely flipped. And now, in fact, you see at the Republican convention, union leaders, workers are now praising J.D. Vance, and they're invited to the Republican convention. That's a complete flip-flop. So the Democratic Party, the party of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, has gone from being the party of working class people to being the party of white-collar suburban women. That's basically who votes for the Democrats now. And they don't want to talk about the fact that they've lost workers and the blue-collar people, that those people aren't going to vote for them and don't vote for them anymore. Donald Trump had, I don't mean to change the subject, but he had a brilliant piece of political strategy. He told a story at his speech last night about how he was having dinner at one of his hotels in Las Vegas, and the waitress, he asked her, how is it going? And she said, well, they're taking my taxes out of my tips. So in the United States, a big part of people who do service industry jobs like Uber drivers and cab drivers and waitresses and maids and bartenders, a big part of their salary is that they get tipped, right? So that's not the same as it is in Europe. And but that's commonly they get 20% tips, right, on anything they do. And in the 80s, that they decided to tax those tips before they were untaxed. And so now they tax those tips. And she said, well, I wish they wouldn't tax my tips. And Donald Trump didn't even realize that that was a thing because he's been a billionaire his whole life. And so his big proposal is to take that tax away. Do you know how many votes that's the thing that's going to take people who don't vote and turn them into voters, or people who are on the fence about voting, and it's going to make sure they show up to vote. That's him doing something directly for the blue collar worker of America that nobody's done in decades and in a generation for them. So that was a brilliant. So in that moment, he's getting to the left of the Democratic Party. This guy who they paint as an extreme right-winger, as a Hitler, as a Stalin, he is at the snap of a finger, he's gotten economically to the left of those entire Democratic Party. And it's not that hard to do because the Democrats are completely in the pocket of Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, big pharma, and health insurance companies. And so Donald Trump, it takes just one move like that, and he can be a hero of the workers, which that is a move that actually will make him a hero of workers.
Jimmy, Dore, bear with me. I'm just going to bring in Andrew Eborn in the studio in London. Andrew, like me, we grew up, did we not, in this country, on this side of the Atlantic, watching the movies, watching television series, and really sort of internalizing the idea that the Democratic Party in the States were the goodies, the white hat wearing cowboys riding to the rescue. What are we to make of what the Democrat Party does next? What ought they to do? What can they do?
Well, it is extraordinary, isn't it? And talking about flip-flop, the biggest flip-flop of all was J.D. Vance, which sounds like a sort of a discount sportswear store, doesn't it? What he basically said, talking about the rhetoric and how that changed, he called Trump a potential American Hitler and cultural heroine and an idiot and so on and so forth. And he said that was back in 2016. And what he did, there's nothing more persuasive than a convert, the road to Damascus moment, if you like. Because what he said in interviews when lots of journalists rightly brought it up. He said, well, that's what I thought then, but I now realise that Trump was a brilliant president, and I've changed my mind on him. And I've also realised the media lies about Trump. So working on that sort of basis, and just as your other guest was talking about, Trump is brilliant at working on that sort of basis, working out how you can do the art of the deal, bringing in other people on that sort of thing. So he's almost guaranteed to win now. And I think he was. He's a changed man from as a result of the horrendous events that we saw with that shooting. But it's right, whenever there's a vacuum, that's when the conspiracy theories come in, and that's why we need to sort of work out. There are so many questions to be asked about those particular shootings, why the Secret Service didn't scan the appropriate buildings and so on and so forth. Why was that particular person allowed so close when others in the crowd could spot him and alerted that sort of side? All of those questions need to be answered. But I think in terms of Trump, from what I've seen, he certainly seems a different man in terms of that. Certainly the rhetoric has changed, and the ballistic sort of language has been turned down. And I think that's absolutely right and proper.
Jimmy Dore, how do you assess the choice of JD? What do you make of that? You know, I myself, I was most aware of him because of that memoir, the Hillbilly Eulogy, or I can't remember the name of the
Elegy.
book. Elegy. It was a very effective movie.
Hillbilly Elegy, that's it.
Yeah. Jimmy, what was your initial reaction and response when you heard that JD Vance was to be the running mate?
Well, I was hoping he was going to pick RFK Jr., but I think RFK had already turned him down for that, right? So that was my first. But I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. But the fact that J.D. Vance gets accolades from the head of the Teamsters Union, right, for being on their side on all the big issues at the time, getting health care for railroad workers and to stop outsourcing jobs out of the country. And and plus he's very strong on the Ukraine issue, right? So that's way better than any Democrat right now. That's kind of amazing. And so it's basically saying that J.D. Vance is now the leading candidate to be president in 2028, right? And because there's no doubt that if he doesn't get assassinated, Donald Trump, that he's going to be president and J.D. Vance will be the vice president. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. He's a little bit of a saber rattler when it comes to China. And of course, he's in the pocket of the AIPAC lobby, which is Israel, right? Which is there isn't a viable candidate in the United States that doesn't seem to work for AIPAC in Israel. So go ahead.
Do you think that plays in a bit to what you were saying about Trump as a deal maker, and certainly a self-described deal maker? Do you think that element of necessary compromise appeals to him, possibly? The idea that this is a person who has points that play to my point of view and others that fly in the face of my point of view. Do you think it appeals to his need to strike a deal?
So, it's funny. I just found a piece of video the other day of Donald Trump talking about what he often speaks in hyperbolic language, right? And that's him. He's asking for he's always thinking about how to make a deal. So he asks for the moon, and then he doesn't start from his compromise position. He starts from a position where he's willing to work down from. And so he speaks over the top hyperbole when it comes to the Israel-Gaza situation. And he, again, gives all the lip service possible he can to the Israeli position. But here's the thing. I saw a video where he talked about he goes, yeah, I think I could make a deal. So that's, again, what he wants to do. He wants to find a deal for the Palestinians and the Israelis that everybody could be happy with. But what he said in this video was that it turns out one side doesn't want to make a deal. And they asked him, which side is that? He said, well, I don't want to say, because I don't want to tip my hand. But then I found another video where he said he had a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he said, Bibi, let's make a deal. And it didn't, what kind of deal do you want? And Bibi didn't want a deal. And he said, you don't even want one. And so I think that that bodes well. That to me, he would be a better person to negotiate the Israel-Palestine problem than Joe Biden or anybody else in politics right now in the United States on a national level. So you're exactly right. I think that his flex, which is why he never got into a war. He was a president for 4 years. He's the only president in my lifetime didn't start a war. Barack Obama was not a departure from George Bush. He took us from 2 wars to 7 wars, right? And you see what Joe Biden did. Everybody gave him accolades for getting us out of Afghanistan. But the reason why he was allowed to get us out of Afghanistan by the military-industrial complex was because he had another war in the chamber, and it was the Ukraine war that they've been ramping up for since at least 2014, when the United States overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine. So you're right. I think it's the lesser of two evil in this situation is not Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, which, by the way, Joe Biden is going to drop out now because Barack Obama has publicly come out against him.
Jimmy Dore, as always, it's a real pleasure to hear you, ruminate and your quick fire thoughts about all of this. So I'll look forward to talking to you again in the near future. But for tonight, thank you so much, Jimmy Dore.
My pleasure. Good to see you. Thanks for everything.
Thank you. Another break's upon us, after which Ukraine. Is Ukraine the dividing line? What are we to make of the incoming government committing us to, well, forever war in Ukraine for as long as it takes? We'll be picking that up after the break. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Bear with me, George Samuel, while I involve also Andrew Eborn in the studio in London. Andrew, what was your automatic response to the pictures of Volodymyr Zelensky and therefore Ukraine being put metaphorically and literally at the heart of the freshly minted British government?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And George, it's always a pleasure to see George and share a studio with him. The reality is that we have our own issues. And they should be front and centre. And George mentioned about Viktor Orban. I mean, he was the great peacemaker, if you like. He's met with Russia, he's met with China, he's trying to do this. And rather than people getting behind him, there was a letter written on the 15th of July, signed by a number of European members of Parliament, who basically called for Hungary to lose its voting rights under Article 7, because they said that his peace mission, was basically not authorised. It wasn't consistent with EU policy, which was basically to support Ukraine. So I think I always make the point that we're not trying to take either side in this. What we are is pro-peace. And I think the more that discussions along those sort of lines are shut down, the more dangerous it gets. But the rhetoric in this is very dangerous, very expensive, both in terms of money and also lives.
George Samueli, how much attention should we pay, when you talk about perhaps a change of administration in Washington and what that might mean for American interests, but we also look on at Ukraine and contemplate the involvement there of transnational entities like BlackRock, enormous other transnational corporations like ExxonMobil and Chevron and Halliburton, poised to take advantage of the natural resources there. Do you think that has any bearing? Is British policy, Keir Starmer Labour policy, being shaped by corporations, that kind of stakeholder capitalism, rather than the national interests of America or anyone else?
No, I think that in the case of Keir Starmer, I think that's a fairly consistent theme of successive administrations in the United Kingdom. It is that we need to, at all times, to keep in with the Americans. You know, whoever's the American president, we have to follow the Americans, because somehow the only way Britain gets to punch above its weight in world affairs is through its so-called special relationship with the United States. Of course, it's entirely one-sided, the special relationship. The Americans certainly don't regard the British as in any way a special relationship. It's the British who regard the Americans as a special relation. But nonetheless, all prime ministers, ever since the hapless Anthony Eden, have believed that they have, at all times, they must keep in with the Americans. And I think that Keir Starmer is part of that. But to your point about the corporations, absolutely, that the United States has been driven by buying up the entirety of Ukraine, and that started immediately after the Maidan overthrow of the government of Viktor Yanukovych. All the corporations moved in, and all the various carpetbaggers, such as Hunter Biden, Hunter Biden's friends, they all moved in within months of the overthrow of the legal government of Ukraine to make a lot of money. And that's why the Biden and the Biden people, all these various Democrats, are so wedded to this policy in Ukraine, because they and all their friends and associates are making a lot of money. And, they've bought up all the agricultural land, that's now owned by international corporations. They've bought up all the natural resources, again, owned by corporations. And of course, as you said, there are all these hedge funds planning on making big investments guaranteed by the U.S. government. They're not just going to throw their own money around. Guaranteed by the U.S. government, they're going to make a lot of money. So there's a huge amount of money. The least that anyone is worried about is the people of Ukraine. So there's a lot of money to be made here, and this is the way to sort of keep together this bogus transatlantic alliance.
George Samuel, I think it's for me, what breaks me, is the way in which it is the people of Ukraine that are just being overlooked and or trampled underfoot in the midst of all of this, and that this shameless laundering of money, this pursuit of profit via a war that's perpetuated for no other reason but to make profit is. I think is becoming increasingly hard to look at without, feeling physically ill. But George Samueli, thank you once again. I'll be calling upon you for further insight in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you for joining me tonight. Another break is upon us, but after that, I'll be speaking to Ralph Schulhammer, because in the tradition of the Neil Oliver Show, it is now Ralph Schulhammer time. Ralph, bear with me. Andrew Eborn in the studio in London. It's a very interesting thought, isn't it? I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said that if you take away religion from people, they don't believe in nothing, rather they believe in anything. Right. And I think to develop that idea of Ralph's, that if you take away love of your own country from people, then that need, either willingly or unwillingly, is projected somewhere else. But are our leaders so-called reaping the poisoned harvest of decades of undermining meaning in people's lives and love of country, love of home?
No, I think you're absolutely right. People need purpose in their life. And by their very nature, by our very nature, we are tribal. This is why you follow football teams and various other things with such passion. And the trouble is this, Neil and Ralph, and I love your Ralph Hammer time. I think that's hilarious. So good one on that. But the reality is this, is that when times are tough, we basically pull up the hatches, don't we? We say, look, we blame it on all these jolly foreigners and all these other people from different tribes. And as a result, result, we try to look to our own, as it were. And there is that sort of, why you might see the rise of the right on that sort of basis. The biggest concern that I have is that we live in a very diseased information age where we're surrounding ourselves with our own prejudices. We're listening just to people who have the same ideas of us, and so on and so forth. And that's not good for the world as a whole, is it?
Ralph, you mentioned at the top there what is happening, has been happening in Leeds. I'm always very sensitive to the thought that, as well as that trouble being what it is, it feels increasingly, this being one event amongst many, that all of this is being stoked. It feels as if the same one, ill-willing, malevolent hand is pulling all of the same strings, and that it's so convenient that we'd be invited to, concentrate on Leeds, and concentrate on a racial issue or a religious issue, or make it look that way, while overlooking the fact that all of us ordinary people feel increasingly that we're just being herded from one chaotic situation to the next, to prevent us having the time and the organisation to pull together.
No, I completely agree. I think also what your guest in the studio says is absolutely right. So this is something that's very important for me to say, because I think both of you made an excellent and important point. When we take this issue of patriotism and nationalism, I think it's very important to say that this is, for me at least, and I think for most people who understand it this way, particularly also in the UK, it's a cultural term. Right, so I have many, and I'm sure you do as well. I have many people of different religion and ethnic backgrounds who are fervent Austrian patriots and Austrian nationalists. And then I have Austrian friends and acquaintances who are just as white as I am, who have completely fallen victim to this wonderful term that the British philosopher Roger Scruton termed oikophobia, like fear of your own, a rejection of your own. So this is not something that has anything to do with race, heritage, or you name it, right? You can choose an identity. You can come to a country. It's what Konstantin Kissin wrote in his book, right? A love letter to the West, or an immigrant's love letter to the West. And the other point, I think you're also absolutely correct. Something is breaking at the moment. Now, I cannot tell you, and we will have to investigate this in our further conversations, to what extent this is on purpose and to what extent it is those who are responsible are also losing control. I think there is something going on here. But I cannot really put my finger on it. I think it's a mixture, right? It's a mixture of what we also discussed in great detail of deliberate malfeasance, of incompetence, and of people entirely overestimating their capacities and capabilities.
I'm increasingly of a mind to watch what I'm being encouraged to look at and wonder why I'm being asked to look at that, because it makes me feel as if I'm probably in the manner of a magician, don't look at this hand while this other hand does something else. And also, yes, as we've discussed recently, Ralph, the elections that have gone across Europe and in the UK, where we've seen the rise of the so-called right, and the rise of and the success and the popularity of those who champion family and community and country and nation and borders, the fact that those centralising, the bureaucrats and the rest, the WEF and the WHO, tried to stamp down on that kind of natural feeling, makes me think if they don't like it, it must be because it is that which they perceive as the greatest threat to them.
Yes, and by the way, as you said, they do it in the open. Again, precisely the conversation we are having right now, I have it time and time and again, and people say, "Oh, Ralph, you are a conspiracy theorist." I say, there is no conspiracy. You heard it just recently. So the European Union is now picking a fight with Elon Musk because they are terrified of Twitter and X, because you can disseminate information that they don't like, right? They just recently closed down a magazine in Germany, not my kind of magazine, but that's beyond the point. And they basically repurposed a law against illegal organizations and said, well, having a magazine is the same as being an organization, therefore we can ban you without any court action, without anything. And of course, it's a massive infringement on free speech, and everybody hopes now that the Constitutional Court will undo this, but even if it has to go to the Constitutional Court, is already a problem. The other thing I think we have to talk about, and Michio mentioned it previously, what just happened in the United States. I mean, I'm just in awe to believe, can the Secret Service really be that incompetent, or is there something else going on? I mean, the more information that comes out here, I'm sorry. I mean, either they are complete dullards, or it is something else. And to be honest, I don't know which answer to those two questions would make me more comfortable, because I think both answers would be frustrating.
I was talking with a previous guest, Ralph. Andrew and I discussed it. I'm so discombobulated by the metamorphosis of the United States of America. You know, as one of my kind of vintage who grew up trusting the Democrat Party rather than the Republican Party, and the way they were invariably portrayed as the good guys and the people with the better ideas in any television series or any movie. And now I look on at America, and I honestly just don't know what I'm looking at. You know, is it the end of an empire?
I don't know. I mean, one thing I always tend to say, but maybe I said it one time too often, is never underestimate the United States. I mean, they had weird and crazy periods in their history before Andrew Jackson, right? Or you had Woodrow Wilson, who after a stroke, where basically his wife was running the government. So these things have happened before, and very often the United States showed a very strong capacity to renew and reinvent themselves. And in many ways, more than ever before, I mean, this is so fascinating. I believe that at the moment, Donald Trump turns out to be a unifying figure, whatever you think about him. But if you look at his politics, if you look at the way in which he's talking, even before the assassination attempt and even now, this is not a man of anger, right? This is not a man who wants to divide the country. This is a man who, I believe, in many ways, if we want to use this term, because we have gotten so used to no longer using it, a heroic individual in many ways, at least in the reaction to the assassination attempt. But he has his foibles, he has his moral failings. So no, I'm not saying he's a demigod or anything. But I believe that kind of this outsider nature that he has, that maybe this is what's very often needed. I think that the political managerial class that we have in so many parts of the West are really part of the problem, because ultimately they despise the population, because they see themselves as, you know, the technocrats who know all the best solutions, who know what's supposed to do, and the electorate, the people, we are more or less in the way of doing what they believe is right, which you and I agree very often is not right, because we saw this unfold over the last couple of decades. But I think this is really a difference, and this is why I'm still hopeful for the United States. For all the flaws they have, right, for all the misbehaves, for all the crimes they have committed, I think on the long run, a renewed United States is to the benefit of all of us.
Absolutely, Ralph Schulhammer. I've always loved the thought of America, you know, and I've always thought that the American concept of a nation was, unrealized or not, is such a wonderful potential idea, you know, to even attempt to live up to. But potent stuff, fascinating stuff. Ralph Schulhammer, we will continue this conversation very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. All the best to London.
Thank you. You've been watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thank you to all of my guests, especially to the ever-tolerant and ever-patient Andrew Eborn, Ralph Schulhammer, everyone else. We will be back, God willing, next week.